The town is asleep, except for the bakers and their ovens, which are very much awake. This is not just a story about bread. It's a story about fire, about survival, and about how the humble act of baking could be the spark that raised your whole community. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this era unless you were really, really good at not sneezing near kindling. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love seeing that. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly past timber frame buildings that lean like sleepy drunks into the street. The stones beneath your feet are slick with dew, and somewhere ahead, a door creaks open. The village baker's already up, rubbing smoke from his eyes, stumbling toward the bakehouse that might just incinerate the neighborhood if he's not careful. It's easy to forget that in the Middle Ages, everything was flammable. Houses, clothes, roofing, even the dried herbs hanging from your ceiling like a spice-based death trap. The bakehouse, often positioned at the edge of town for very good reason, was a simple structure built of stone or clay, housing a large domed oven, basically a furnace disguised as a dinner plan. Some villages shared a communal oven, where townsfolk brought their own dough and waited their turn in what was both a social ritual and an accidental fire drill. You'd wait hours, chat, share news, or nap dangerously close to a bed of coals. What could possibly go wrong? Plenty, it turns out. One careless coal kicked loose, one bread peel left, smoldering too long, one child chasing a chicken into the oven room, and you could wake up to the town bell ringing furiously. Not for prayer, but for buckets. The average medieval home was constructed of wattle and daub, with straw roofs and wooden supports that might as well have been dipped in oil. In towns like London and Rouen, fire patrols would roam the streets at night, essentially proto-firefighters without hoses, shouting warnings like, "Put out your fire," or "Cover your embers," in a tone that strongly implied, "Seriously, Gary, again?" Some towns had curfews specifically for fire. By a certain hour, your hearth had to be raked out or banked with ash. The problem? Bakers didn't get that luxury. Bread had to be ready by sunrise. That meant lighting fires before dawn, baking by torchlight, and keeping ovens hot for hours. A baker's fire wasn't just allowed, it was necessary. And that made bakers, ironically, both the most respected and most feared people in town. They were essential, and they were dangerous. One particularly famous case from 1212 London, a bakery fire near London Bridge, engulfed not just buildings but the bridge itself. People fleeing the flames ended up trapped on the wooden structure. As the fire raced across it, dozens perished, not just from burns but from jumping into the Thames. And here's the thing, historians still argue whether it was an actual bakery or a nearby cookhouse. Either way, the route was the same: live flame and poor planning. Now picture yourself back in our sleepy village. You're sitting on a low stool in the bakehouse, blinking in the warm glow of coals. You smell the rising dough, the sharp tang of smoke, the vague undercurrent of panic that no one admits out loud. The baker nudges a flat round loaf into the back of the oven with a long wooden peel, an awkward, splintery tool that has claimed more eyebrows than anyone admits. He glances at the vent hole carved above the door, trying to judge the draft. Too little air, and the fire dies. Too much, and the flames leap like excited puppies at your curtains. You ask how he keeps from burning down the village. He shrugs. "Mostly luck," he says, then chuckles but doesn't really deny it. He points to the floor, where sand has been scattered to absorb sparks. He nods toward the bucket of water in the corner, not enough to douse a real blaze, but a comfort item. like a medieval fire extinguisher placebo. And he tells you something strange. There are times when the oven speaks. Not with words, of course, but with a series of hisses, creaks, and cracks. A good baker listens to the walls. The clay dome expands with heat, the stones shift subtly, and if the oven groans too loudly, you step back. It's not mystical. It's just experience. But it sounds a bit like a dragon about to sneeze. Every town had at least one story of a careless baker and the disaster that followed. In some places, you'd be fined, exiled, or worse. In others, the punishment was a full-blown inquest, especially if the fire claimed lives. And yet, most villagers still brought their dough to the bakehouse, grumbled about wait times, and exchanged gossip about whose sourdough smelled weird. Let's be honest, you didn't have many options. Baking bread in your home was often banned, precisely because it was too risky. Communal baking wasn't just efficient, it was a safety measure, and a way for the village to keep an eye on who was handling open flames. You could be the best baker in Christendom, but one fluke gust of wind, or a squirrel knocking over a lantern, and suddenly, you were the one everyone remembered for generations, as in, don't do a Margaret, or he pulled a Tom the Scorcher. And yet, despite the danger, bakers endured. They rose before dawn, worked beside fire all day, and lived in perpetual fear of being the spark that unraveled it all. Their job was to feed the village. Their side hustle was not burning it down. You sit cross-legged just outside the bakehouse now, the sun starting to peek over the thatched rooftops. From here, you hear the oven groaning as the fire reaches its zenith. The warmth radiating from the walls is comforting until you remember it's also the #1 suspect in at least 5 town fires in the last century. The oven isn't just hot, it's alive. And in the Middle Ages, it might be the most dangerous thing in town that isn't wielding a sword. This oven, round, hulking, made of thick clay and lined with fire brick, has been here longer than most of the villagers. It is the hearth, the hub, the daily volcano. And the baker, your sooty companion, treats it like a temperamental pet. You don't simply light a medieval oven. You stoke it, coax it, offer it dry kindling and whispered bribes in the form of seasoned logs. The fire must be built slowly, or the dome will crack too quickly, and it roars up like an angry baron you didn't bow to. The process of firing up the oven takes hours. First, a small flame, then the kindling, then progressively larger logs. Each stage has its own rhythm. The goal isn't to burn the bread, it's to heat the oven evenly and let it retain that heat after the flames are raked out. That's right, you bake without fire. Once it's hot enough, you remove the embers, sweep the floor with a damp cloth, and slide the dough in. The heat stored in the thick walls does the rest. But here's the medieval catch. If you misjudge the timing, the temperature, or the oxygen flow, the oven doesn't just fail to bake your bread, it vents flames like a chimney possessed, which wouldn't be such a problem, except that medieval towns didn't believe in space. Homes, shops, stables, bakehouses, they all leaned into each other like old friends at the tavern. Fire didn't need help to spread. A hot oven and a stray breeze were more than enough. That's why many towns built their bakehouses outside the main walls. It was a preemptive, we know you're gonna mess up eventually gesture. Of course, that meant carrying your dough across muddy fields, hoping the pigs didn't eat it, or that some local kid didn't accidentally trip and knock your loaf into the stream. But it was better than waking up to your house ablaze because Margaret overproofed her rye. Now, let's talk about the oven itself. Because yes, historians still argue whether the typical village bake oven was strictly communal, or whether small households had access to private ones. In wealthier homes, especially manor houses, the kitchen often included a bread oven, But for the average peasant, your oven was public, your fire was borrowed, your place in line was sacred. Inside, the heat is now peaking. The dome glows faintly orange, and the stones hiss when a drop of water hits them. The baker, sleeves rolled, eyes rimmed with soot, moves with slow precision. He reads the oven like a manuscript. Not because he's literate, he probably isn't, but because centuries of oral tradition have taught him to watch for subtle signs. The way the smoke trails, the color of the flames, the feel of the handle on the oven peel. If it's too hot to hold, it's too hot for dough. And then there's the fire tongue. Yes, really. That's what some bakers called the small flicker of flame that licked out of the oven mouth when the temperature was just right. Too much tongue, burnt bread. No tongue, cold crust, just enough, perfection. It's like Goldilocks, if she were covered in ash and vaguely worried about combustion. Outside the bakehouse, you notice the faint black scars on the stones, marks from past overfires. The smell of char still clings to the woodpile, reminding everyone that this place once nearly took out the tannery, and would have, if not for that one drunk with a barrel of cider and a surprisingly effective bucket chain. A quirkier piece of trivia. Some villages believed a bakehouse should be blessed before use, not because they were especially pious, but because they'd seen one too many acts of God, involving yeast and ignition. In Germany, certain regions conducted little rituals where a priest would toss holy water near the oven before its first bake. In Italy, they sometimes buried coins near the hearth for protection, and in one truly delightful French town, they left small offerings, crumbs, flowers, even bits of dried cheese for the oven sprite. You heard that right. Oven, sprite. Of course, no one officially believed in such creatures, but no one officially disbelieved either. You didn't take chances with fire spirits, or bread, or really anything that could make your house explode. You ask the baker if he believes in oven sprites. He snorts. I believe in dough that won't rise and neighbors that won't shut up, he says, jabbing a loaf deeper into the chamber. But then, a beat later, he casually tosses a breadcrumb near the base of the hearth, just in case. Modern kitchens have timers, digital thermometers, and smoke detectors. This place has instinct, superstition, and a goat who occasionally wanders inside and causes absolute chaos. You pet the goat's head absently as it sniffs a bag of barley. The baker doesn't even look up. He's seen worse. Once, a rooster roosted in the woodpile and burst into the room mid-bake, like a feathered demon. The oven door was open. The rooster flew in. The rooster flew out on fire. No one talked about it again. Still, there's beauty in the rhythm. Fire, ash, sweep, dough, bake, cool, repeat. It's hypnotic, calming, which is ironic, considering the stakes. Because no matter how careful you are, accidents happen. And when they do, they're not small. Historical records are peppered with little footnotes of bakery mishaps. In 1298, a baker in Ghent was accused of negligence after his oven fire spread to 4 homes. In 1357, a bakehouse collapsed in York, crushed 2 apprentices and scorched the brewery next door. And then, of course, there are the rumors of bakers who vanished after particularly bad fires. Vanished, meaning either fled in shame or got a little too close to the wrong end of a torch-wielding mob. That's why, despite all their skill and usefulness, bakers lived under constant scrutiny. You might love the smell of their crusts, but you also knew exactly where they lived, and that's not always a comforting fact. So next time you slide a baguette into your oven, or tap the top of a loaf to see if it sounds done, remember the medieval baker, eyelids twitching from heat, hands cracked from ash, ears tuned for danger. They weren't just baking bread, they were taming dragons. You step back into the cool morning light, blinking away the oven's glow, The village is beginning to stir. A few windows creak open, hens cluck indignantly in the lanes, and someone sneezes violently in the distance, probably near a haystack, which, as you now realize, is basically Tinder with ambitions. It's time to learn how this quaint, combustible world tried to keep itself not on fire. Here's a surprise. Medieval towns weren't completely reckless. They had fire codes, actual ones, written into town charters, passed as edicts, and occasionally shouted by irate town criers, who probably doubled as unofficial fire marshals. You imagine a slightly sweaty man in a lopsided hat ringing a bell and bellowing, "Douse your flames, lest ye burn and pay." That kind of energy. One of the earliest known fire safety codes in England dates back to 1189 in London's Assize of Buildings. It dictated what materials could be used in construction, preferably stone, definitely not thatch. It also required that certain buildings maintain fire breaks between them. Problem was, few people followed the rules. Stone was expensive, fire breaks were awkward, and besides, your neighbor already built too close, so what's the point? Still, fire ordinances were passed all over Europe. In Paris, a baker could be fined heavily for operating a bakehouse too close to wooden buildings. In Italian cities, chimney placement was regulated to avoid sparks drifting onto neighboring roofs. And in Nuremberg, Germany, not only were bakehouses inspected, but bakers had to swear public oaths that they would maintain safe practices. That's right, bakers took literal fire oaths. Historians still argue whether these codes were regularly enforced or just ignored until disaster struck. Some say enforcement depended on the size of the bribe. Others claim that certain guilds, especially the bakers' guilds, held each other accountable. And others still believe it was more about performative regulation than real safety, like putting a tiny bucket next to a bonfire and calling it preparedness. But the rules existed, and in some towns they were surprisingly specific. For instance, in parts of medieval Flanders, bakers could only light their ovens during daylight hours, unless granted a special license. The logic? Fires were easier to spot and stop during the day. Night baking was risky, mysterious, and often accused of being, shall we say, too smoky for comfort. Let's not forget the bakehouse curfew. In several English towns, there were literal bells, curfew bells, that rang out each evening, signaling everyone to cover their fires. The word curfew itself comes from the Old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. That's not bedtime poetry. That's a public safety alert. And guess who was usually exempt from the curfew? That's right, the bakers, which made them once again both valuable and suspect. You sit now on a small stone wall just across from the bakehouse, watching smoke drift from its vent. The baker wipes sweat from his forehead with a cloth that's more ash than linen. A local constable walks by, giving him a nod. Not quite trustful, but acknowledging. There's an understanding here. If something goes wrong, it'll start there. You spot a curious detail next to the bakehouse entrance. A wooden placard scorched at the corners, with faint writing. It's a record of previous incidents, accidents, warnings. In some towns, bakehouses kept a running tally of near misses and fines. It was part reputation, part cautionary tale. Remember the great biscuit blowout of '43? One might joke. Only half joking. The scorch marks on the ceiling tell a story no one laughs at for long. Here's a lesser-known practice. Some towns required bakehouses to be painted with a lime wash, a chalky white coating that was mildly fire retardant and reflected heat. It also had the added benefit of revealing soot buildup more clearly, which helped with inspections. You could call it the medieval version of installing a smoke alarm, except this one yells at you with black streaks and the occasional rat dropping. But medieval fire safety wasn't all rules and bells. It was also communal. Towns had designated fire teams, buckets and all. These weren't professional firefighters, mind you. They were whoever was nearby and not actively on fire. Wells were centrally located for quick access, and long poles with hooks were kept handy to pull down flaming thatch roofs before they could spread. Brutal, yes, but effective-ish, a quirkier fringe tidbit. In some parts of Eastern Europe, pigs were trained, yes, trained, to respond to certain fire cues such as bells or the smell of smoke. Not because they would fight the fire, of course, but because their squealing alerted nearby humans that something was wrong. Fire pigs, barking smoke detectors with hooves. You can't make this stuff up. And while we're at it, ever wonder how towns tested their emergency readiness? Some towns held mock fire drills where someone would shout, "Fire," and the village would scramble to react. But these quickly became excuses for small festivals, feasts, songs, and the occasional staged oven rescue, which defeated the purpose, but hey, everyone had a good time, and no one got burned that day. As you stroll slowly toward the village square, you spot a group of children skipping stones. One little boy pretends he's the oven king, commanding his imaginary subjects to bring more wood, before dramatically falling over, yelling, "It's too hot." The other kids laugh, but it's all grounded in truth. Even play was shaped by the looming presence of fire. And that's the thing about medieval fire laws. They weren't just regulations, they were woven into the rhythm of life. Everyone knew the sound of a fire bell. Everyone knew where the buckets were kept. Everyone had a baked-in fear of smoke where it didn't belong. You grew up knowing that bread could save your life, or end it. Some bakehouses posted daily notices about oven use, warning townsfolk when particularly large fires would be lit. Others limited baking to certain days, bread days, so that fire risk was consolidated and easier to manage. And in rare cases, towns rotated who got to bake, like a weirdly intense HOA policy for hearths. And yet, even with these rules, fire was never fully contained, because you can't regulate the wind, or a spark, or a roof that's already too dry. You can only prepare, watch, and hope that today, your baker is sober, his apprentice isn't clumsy, and the goat hasn't chewed through the woodpile again. As you head back past the bakehouse, the baker gives you a nod. He's sliding the last loaf out now. It's golden, perfect, steaming just slightly. The crust crackles as it cools. It smells like warmth, like comfort, like trust. You nod back, knowing the risks he's taken for that single loaf, and knowing that tomorrow, he'll do it all again. Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where bread wasn't just life. It was a life-threatening hazard. You're about to walk the cobbled lanes of a medieval village at dawn, where chimney smoke curls lazily above thatched roofs, the scent of yeast and ash clings to the misty air, and every wooden home stands one spark away from disaster. You find a quiet spot near the well, leaning against the stone as the first round of bread cools on wide wooden trays beside the bakehouse door. A sleepy dog dozes nearby, twitching slightly, probably dreaming of chasing ducks into fire pits. The baker's apprentice emerges, arms smeared with ash and dough, hair singed on one side, looking like he just narrowly survived a Viking raid. And in a way, he has. Except his opponent isn't a sword. It's a centuries-old oven with a grudge. Being an apprentice baker in the Middle Ages wasn't just about learning to knead or measure flour. It was a survival gauntlet. You began young, usually around age 10 or 12, and were immediately plunged into an unforgiving schedule. Wake before dawn, stoke fires with hands barely big enough to carry wood, scrub soot from stones, and keep your toes clear of glowing coals that had no regard for youthful optimism. Forget recipes. Your first lesson was where the water buckets were kept, and how fast you could run with one. The test of fire was more than metaphor. You earned your place through singed eyebrows and calloused palms. You learned to listen for the oven's creak, to smell the difference between a ready hearth and one waiting to belch fire. One wrong move and you'd be tending blisters instead of bread. Medieval kitchens didn't believe in second chances or gloves. Apprentices worked long, brutal hours. No holidays, no weekends, just endless cycles of kindling, sweeping, baking, and occasionally ducking when someone dropped a too-hot tray. It wasn't unusual for apprentices to sleep right there in the bakehouse, curled in the corner on sacks of grain, eyes still twitching from watching the ovens glow too long. And they did it not for glory, but for the slim chance that one day they'd graduate to journeyman and eventually master, a full-fledged baker with the town's respect, a good income, and yes, the terrifying responsibility of not burning the place down. But first you had to survive the rites of passage. One involved mastering the ash rake, a long metal rod used to drag embers from the oven. Wielded improperly, it could flip live coals into your face. One baker in Cologne supposedly lost half his beard and was known forever after as Old Whispermouth. Another test? The dough paddle, so long and unwieldy that it doubled as a medieval punishment device in some towns. If you could manipulate it without knocking over jars or fellow apprentices, you were halfway there. And then came the smoke test. This wasn't official, but widely practiced. At some point, your master would have you tend the fire alone while he stepped out, usually to the market, which really meant to lurk just outside and watch. You were judged not by how quickly you baked the bread, but by how much of the village was still standing when he returned. Some didn't pass. Some panicked and let the fire die, producing underbaked loaves that were harder than roof tiles. Others let it rage, crisping everything to a charcoal log and triggering town-wide suspicion. And still others, well, there's a story about a boy named Will in Kent who forgot to close the flue. His loaves were fine, but his eyebrows were never the same. Historians still argue whether apprentice systems in bakeries were stricter than in other trades. Some say yes. Because of the fire risk, bakers were harsher on their trainees. Others point out that butchers dealt with cleavers, smiths with molten iron, and coopers with barrels that occasionally exploded. The difference? Bread was daily. Every failure was visible. Every success eaten. The stakes were personal. You watch now as the apprentice practices moving bread from tray to table with a peel longer than he is tall. His master watches too, arms crossed, expression unreadable, but there's something softer in his posture now. A flicker of respect maybe, or maybe just gratitude that this batch didn't catch fire. Another fun tidbit. Apprentices were often required to memorize local fire laws, particularly the ones about bakehouse safety. In some towns, this was done by rote recitation every week, like medieval school children repeating multiplication tables. "The oven must not roar after vespers," they'd chant. "The door must remain unblocked." You imagine a dozen soot-streaked kids muttering like monks in a smoky haze. Of course, apprentices weren't always obedient. Some snuck bites of dough, others shirked firewatch duties to flirt with the brewer's daughter. One legend from Brittany tells of a clever boy who built a miniature oven in the woods, just to practice secretly without being yelled at. His loaves? Perfect. His punishment? Also perfect. He had to bake for the entire village for a week, without sleep. He emerged victorious, if twitchy. But for all the hard lessons, apprentices were the backbone of the bakehouse. They were the reason loaves appeared at market each morning, the reason fires stayed, mostly, contained, and the reason bakers didn't go mad from doing it all alone. If the master baker was the head, the apprentice was the soot-covered hands and blistered feet. And sometimes, just sometimes, they got a reward. A crust end, a cooled roll, a nod of approval, maybe even a new apron, less riddled with holes than the last. These were the victories that mattered. And when they finally became journeymen, traveling from town to town with bread paddle in hand and calluses like iron, they carried those lessons and the scars with pride. You catch the apprentice watching you now, noticing your attention. He grins sheepishly, then tosses you a roll. It's hot, imperfect, slightly uneven, but it's yours. And somehow, that matters more than you expected. The roll is still warm in your hand as you wander deeper into the village, munching thoughtfully. It's a bit lopsided, slightly underbaked in the middle, and yet utterly satisfying. You understand now why bread was sacred, not just for its taste or sustenance, but for the absurdly dangerous path it took to reach your mouth. And if you think bakers had it rough, wait until you meet their fire-sharing cousins, the brewers. Yes, that's right. In the chaotic culinary Venn diagram of the Middle Ages, bakers and brewers shared more than just a fondness for yeast. In many towns, they literally shared ovens, hearths, and occasionally the blame when something burst into flame. The relationship between bread and beer was as tangled as a woodpile after a goat's been through it. You pass a small alley and catch the bitter scent of hops. There's a brewery here, more accurately, a home where brewing happens. In medieval times, most beer was made at home, often by women, often as a side hustle. It wasn't until later that brewing became formalized and gilded. But in many places, especially in Northern Europe, baking and brewing were sister crafts. Some bakehouses doubled as brew spaces. You can already guess how that went. The shared yeast culture, known as barm, was a literal frothy byproduct of brewing that bakers scooped off the top of fermenting beer vats to leaven their bread. It worked wonders. Unless it didn't. Occasionally, the barm went bad, or was too alcoholic, or contaminated with soot from nearby fires. Result? Exploding dough. And not just metaphorically. When you overfeed yeast and trap it in an enclosed space, say, a loaf in a clay oven with no vent, you get a nice little boom. Nothing massive, but enough to send an apprentice yelping into the street, covered in dough like a tragic meat pie. One tale from Flanders describes a loaf detonation that cracked an oven stone and took out part of a bench. The culprit? Overyeasted barm and someone forgetting to score the top of the loaf. But brewing had its own fire hazards. The boiling of wort, that's pre-beer liquid for the uninitiated, required steady flame, constant stirring, and a distracted brewer could easily let the pot bubble over. One moment, it's beer. The next, it's a sticky inferno racing across your wood floor. Fun fact, in some towns, the fine for boiling over your beer into the fire was double that of a simple cooking flame. Apparently, the fire and the waste of good beer was just too much to bear. And then there was the alewife oven feud. It sounds like folklore, and maybe it partly is, but the basic premise was real. In towns with limited bakehouses or hearths, women who brewed ale often clashed with bakers over access to fire. Some would sneak in at night to warm their brewing kettles. Others bribed apprentices to borrow coals. The result? Late-night firelight, smoldering arguments, and more than a few suspicious scorch marks. Historians still argue whether these shared ovens were officially sanctioned or just informal arrangements. In many places, a bakehouse was a communal resource, so technically anyone could use the fire. But in practice, the baker often held control, and not everyone liked that. One record from 14th century York details a brewer fined for kindling flame without baker's consent. The actual quote includes the phrase singeing of fence and thatch, which, you must admit, has a very specific energy. You now arrive at the back of the bakehouse where a low stone channel snakes away into the ground. A rudimentary flue or chimney extension. It's blackened from decades of smoke and leads suspiciously close to the brewer's shed next door. Coincidence? Doubtful. These two operations were linked not just by craft, but by infrastructure. Some places even built long covered troughs for heat sharing. A medieval version of district heating, if you will. Efficient, until it caught fire. Another odd little fact, in some towns, you could rent fire. Seriously. If you didn't have your own hearth, you could pay a few coins to a neighbor to use theirs. And not just space, actual flame. A burning coal or stick would be carried in a special pot to your home, used to light your own oven or fire pit. There were even fines for dropping said coal and starting a fire along the way. Think of it as Uber, but instead of a ride, it's a flaming stick, and much worse customer service. You ask the baker about this, he shrugs. Fire's fire. You need it, you pay for it. Just don't drop it in the hayloft. Then he laughs, like that exact thing happened yesterday. You're not convinced it didn't, but amid all this fire sharing, yeast borrowing, and smoldering tension, something else was happening. A kind of culinary cooperation. Bread and beer became twin pillars of medieval sustenance, shaped by the same fire, leavened by the same barm, watched over by the same anxious apprentices, and perhaps, in some smudgy corner of an unrecorded town, someone figured out how to do both without setting the pigsty ablaze. You sit again on the stone ledge, roll now finished, and reflect on how absurdly complex daily life was. We romanticize it now. The simplicity, the earthiness, the return to tradition. But you realize that every loaf, every mug of ale, was a minor miracle. It meant someone managed the fire, didn't misjudge the heat, didn't sneeze into a haystack, didn't get distracted by a wandering goose. Someone followed through and didn't burn it all down. A rooster crows. Somewhere nearby, a bucket thuds against stone. You smell hops and smoke and the last hint of that roll's crust still clinging to your fingers. Fire, you think. It gave warmth. It gave bread. It gave beer. And it gave chaos. The sun hangs a little higher now, casting long slants of golden light through gaps in rooftops and the weave of old trees. You stretch, already slightly warm from all the ambient fire you've been near. It's time to discover something you didn't expect to be so dramatic. Medieval fuel strategy. Yes, wood hoarding, turf feuds, and the battle over warm stones. If it sounds petty, that's because it was. And yet, firewood scarcity could spark more tension in a town than a failed exorcism. You walk around the side of the bakehouse where the woodpile sits, or at least what's left of it, bits of damp timber, logs with moss still clinging to their sides, and a few piles of dried cow dung, the medieval backup plan for desperate fuel situations. It's not glamorous, but it burns, poorly, smokily, and with a smell you don't forget. In medieval Europe, wood wasn't just a resource, it was wealth. Entire laws were written around who could gather, cut, or even pick up fallen branches. Commons and forests were closely guarded, and peasants often needed official permission, usually from the local lord, to collect firewood. Dead wood only, the rules insisted. Chop down a live tree, and you might find yourself fined, whipped, or, in one particularly harsh Saxon village, publicly forced to replant it while wearing a hat made of brambles. And bakehouses, of course, needed the best wood. Dry, seasoned, resinous. The kind that could get an oven to the right temperature and keep it there without spitting sparks like an angry porcupine. Bakers and brewers competed for that kind of wood. So did smiths. So did everyone else. Which meant there were actual wood wars. One town in Burgundy saw an entire street brawl break out over a disputed shipment of oak. The baker said he had prearranged it. The brewer claimed she paid more. The blacksmith got involved just for fun. In the end, the magistrate seized the wood and made everyone use turf bricks for a week. Nobody won. You crouch beside the current wood pile and run your fingers along a log. It's a bit damp, not ideal. The apprentice appears, dragging a sack of dry kindling with the resigned expression of someone who knows he's going to have to argue with the cooper later about missing sticks. Because yes, theft was common, and you didn't report it. You just stared pointedly at your neighbor's overly robust wood supply until he got the message. Another strategy? Warm stones. If fuel was scarce, you'd heat large stones during the bake, then cover them with cloth to retain heat longer inside the bakehouse. People even tucked them under beds at night. Some clever baker in the Alps supposedly lined his bakehouse floor with such stones, allowing the room to retain heat long after the fire died. Efficient, also sweaty. Historians still argue whether this stone heating technique was widespread or just regional. Some say it was common in colder climates. Others believe it was more often seen in monastic or noble bakehouses. But there's enough evidence, scrap writings, charred stones found in ruins, to suggest it was, at least, a known trick. You see the method in action now. The baker carefully places 3 large stones near the back of the oven's mouth while the fire is still burning. They'll soak up the heat, then be moved aside during baking. Later, the apprentice will probably stack them in a corner near the kneading bench, where they'll keep the space cozy long into the evening. But this is not just a tale of smart heating. It's also a story of status. If you had good wood, you had respect. If you were caught burning dung, people knew you were struggling. Some towns even had sayings. He burned straw for bread meant you were doing poorly. She smells of bog oak wasn't a compliment. It was a reminder that turf fuel leaves a heavy stink and darker crusts. Fuel choice could also betray your baking schedule. Hardwoods, like oak or ash, were best for long, even heat. Perfect for early morning bread. Softwoods like pine, quick to burn, good for a fast batch or evening scones. Yes, medieval people had scones. No, they weren't triangular. And yes, they too could catch fire. Now, the truly scandalous stuff? Fuel bribes. In some areas, local woodcutters were expected to provide logs to bakers first, especially during religious festivals. But it didn't always happen cleanly. There are records of bakers offering gifts, a nice round loaf, a small flask of ale, a smoked eel, in exchange for better wood. It wasn't corruption, it was networking. One scribe in 13th century Utrecht wrote of a baker who secured the best linden from the forest steward through means not ecclesiastical. The margin note? His crusts were divine. Make of that what you will. There's even mention in some tax records of a fire fee, a seasonal toll paid by bakers to ensure they received uninterrupted access to fuel. In dry seasons, this fee could double, and in drought years, some bakehouses shut entirely, either due to wood scarcity or to avoid triggering a town-wide inferno. You imagine a very tense village meeting where someone says, "No bread this week," and the silence that followed. It wasn't just about economics. It was also survival. A poorly managed fire in a time of fuel stress was even more dangerous. If your fire spread and your neighbor didn't have water nearby because she was saving it for tomorrow's barley soak, the result could be catastrophic. Thatched roofs, shared fences, haylofts, it was all waiting for a reason. And so, fuel became ritual. Bakers gathered wood at dawn. Apprentices dried kindling on racks overhead. Women saved kitchen scraps for slow-burning fires. Children were taught to spot dry bark, and old men sat by the fire muttering about when trees burn properly. You laugh, but that's probably true even now. The baker calls out now, asking the apprentice to rotate the drying rack. It's not just for fuel, it's also for bowls, cloths, anything too damp to function. The heat is shared. Nothing is wasted. Even the smoke serves its purpose, curling up into the rafters and seeping into the beams. A reminder, etched in soot, of every loaf that didn't bring the house down. You sit a while longer, warmed by stone and sun. The wood pile is smaller now. The bread is baked. The fire quiets. And tomorrow, they'll do it all again, with whatever fuel they can find. Later in the day, when most of the town is stirring and the bakehouse smells more of cooling bread than burning wood, you find yourself wandering up the slope path toward the manor estate, the domain of the local lord. Here, everything is quieter, larger, and suspiciously less flammable. The walls are stone. The roofs are tile. The bakehouse, tucked off near the kitchens, is twice the size of the village's, and far less likely to send flaming embers cartwheeling into the chicken coop. Baking at the manor was a different beast altogether. While village bakehouses were practical, chaotic centers of survival, a feudal lord's bakehouse was a performance of wealth. Bigger ovens, better wood, and far more bread. Not because they needed more, but because baking was also political. You step through the arched doorway and into a spacious room with high ceilings and thick beams darkened by time. There's a copper pot of water near the fire, and a small army of kitchen staff moving with the quiet urgency of people who know that dropping a loaf here gets you yelled at by someone wearing a very heavy ring. The manorial baker isn't a freeman like in the village. He's a servant, often a serf, bound to the estate. His job? Bake for the Lord, his household, and the dozens of guests, soldiers, clergy, and opportunists who seem to drift in and out like bread-seeking ghosts. There are often multiple types of bread here: fine white loaves for the high table, rough barley rounds for servants, and trenchers, thick slabs of bread used as edible plates. Yes, plates you can eat, because washing dishes was, apparently, more offensive than chewing on yesterday's stew stains. But here's where it gets more complex. Serfs didn't just work in the bakehouse. Many were required to use it. Lords had banal rights, one of which was the right to demand that tenants bake in the lord's oven, for a fee, of course. The term for this was banal oven, and yes, it sounds like an insult, but it was a real thing. If you were a peasant on the manor's land, you couldn't just build your own oven. That would mean independence, and no one wants that. Instead, you paid to use the lord's oven, and if you tried to sneak a bake at home, you might be fined, shamed, or forced to eat your own undercooked failure in public, which was punishment and indigestion. Historians still argue whether banal ovens were universally resented or grudgingly accepted. Some records show complaints. Loaves burned because the Lord's cook was distracted, or the poor timing meant festival bread didn't finish before dusk. But others suggest the system worked. It centralized risk, kept fires controlled, and most importantly, ensured that the local lord got his cut, literally and figuratively. You watch now as a kitchen boy rotates a heavy wooden peel, sliding out rows of perfectly symmetrical loaves. They're beautiful, glossy, scored in precise patterns. This is not survival bread. This is prestige. You glance down at your own fingers, still sticky from the apprentice's lopsided roll, and wonder if these loaves even taste better, or just richer. But the manor wasn't immune to fire. In fact, when manorial kitchens did catch fire, the results were even more devastating. In 1310, a manor near Toulouse burned for 3 days after a chimney collapsed during the Easter bake. The blaze consumed the kitchen, stables, and part of the hall. The baker survived. The reputation did not. And that's why, even here, safety was paramount. The oven master, yes, that was a title, was responsible for everything. The fire, the staff, the schedule. He kept logs, literal and figurative. He managed fuel, watched for smoke anomalies, and sometimes had to inspect the chimney mid-bake using what one account calls a ladder of questionable faith. If anything went wrong, the blame went uphill fast. You pause near a wall where various tools hang: wooden paddles, ash scrapers, metal hooks, and a long-handled bellows with initials carved into the handle. Some tools have names, passed down like heirlooms: Old Blister Maker, Crumb Catcher, Lady Singe. Tools were revered and feared. You reach out to touch one, but a cook gives you the kind of look that says, "We just waxed that peasant." In quieter corners of the manor, they had luxury most villages couldn't dream of: fire breaks, small stone alleys between structures, designated ash dumps, separate chimneys for each wing. This didn't mean fires didn't happen. It just meant you had a fighting chance. Even so, many manorial bakehouses were built away from the main hall. You look around now and realize everything in this building can be replaced, except the Lord. Keep the fire there. One fringe tidbit: some lords employed fire watchers, low-level staff whose only job was to sit near the oven and make sure nothing sparked where it shouldn't. They often worked in pairs, in shifts, and were allowed to nap in 10-minute bursts as long as one stayed conscious. In colder months, they were rewarded with extra rations. In hotter ones, they were often blamed for sweating near the dough. Occupational hazards. Another curious role was the oven warden, a title found in only a few manors, but documented nonetheless. The oven warden oversaw fuel acquisition, bread inspection, and the temperature logs, kept on wax tablets, or later, parchment. If a loaf was overdone or the oven cooled too quickly, the warden was questioned. One old account describes a man dismissed for failure of warmth. You're not sure that means temperature or attitude, and yet, amid all this structure and status, the rhythm remained the same: fire, ash, dough, bread. The language of baking didn't change, only the stakes. In the village, a bad bake meant hunger. Here, it meant humiliation. You step back out into the courtyard, watching as the kitchen team lines loaves onto long tables. A steward counts each one, nods. Somewhere up in the manor's great hall, a bell rings for a midday meal. Soon the bread will be sliced, dipped, devoured. The fire will cool, the oven will rest, until nightfall, when the cycle begins again. Because no matter how high the walls, or how fine the loaf, the fire must always be fed. You stroll slowly back down from the manor, passing stone walls and carved lintels, your mind still lingering on the thought of those oven wardens and their waxy ledgers. It's almost comforting to imagine someone tracking every crackle, every flare, every smudge of ash. But back in the village, things were messier, especially when it came to a question that seems deceptively simple. Where does the smoke go? Welcome to the medieval chimney dilemma, a problem so persistent, it probably deserves its own tragic ballad. In many homes, The answer to where the smoke went was simply everywhere. Medieval buildings often lacked chimneys in the modern sense. Smoke was expected to rise and exit through holes in the ceiling or gaps in the roof, which sounds fine in theory, until you remember that roofs were thatched, ceilings were wooden, and air holes were also pigeon entry points. So, in the early centuries of the Middle Ages, most structures had central hearths without chimneys. The smoke billowed out and up, eventually finding its way outside, leaving every surface coated in a beautiful shade of lung-blackening soot. This included bakehouses. You imagine now a baker mid-loaf, eyes squinted against smoke, coughing dramatically while an apprentice fans the air with an old flour sack, achieving nothing. Eventually, chimneys did start appearing, slowly, at first in monasteries and manorial estates, where stone construction allowed for more elaborate building design. But even then, the early chimneys were narrow, crooked, and temperamental. Some drew smoke beautifully, others backdrafted like vengeful ghosts. One document from 13th century Burgundy mentions a chimney that wept fire, which is exactly as comforting as it sounds. Historians still argue whether chimneys genuinely reduced the fire risk in bakehouses or made things worse. On the one hand, they allowed smoke to vent upward, away from flammable interiors. On the other, they often sparked fires themselves. Hot embers could rise with the draft, land on thatch, and poof, there goes half the block. In fact, some towns actually banned chimneys on certain streets for this very reason. You reach the village bakehouse just as a gust of wind kicks through the alley, swirling ash around your ankles. The chimney here is a stubby clay pipe, slightly tilted, patched in 3 places, and currently exhaling smoke like a dragon with asthma. The baker sees you eyeing it. "Trust me," he mutters. "It's better than what we had before." Before? That would be the open vent method. A small hole near the top of the oven room, usually paired with a wooden shutter that was supposed to open and close to control airflow. Except the shutters warped, or stuck, or got blocked by birds nesting there. The result? Smoke that lingered and soaked into every loaf. Some villagers even came to prefer smoke crust. It was, for lack of a better term, an acquired taste. One quirkier architectural solution was the smoke shelf, a small ledge or curved indentation built into the chimney shaft to trap stray sparks and redirect smoke. It worked, kind of, until the shelf got clogged with soot and caught fire itself. You imagine a frazzled apprentice poking at it with a broom, while the baker yells in Latin and someone outside starts ringing the "maybe grab a bucket" bell. The inside of the bakehouse is dim now, lit mostly by flickering coals and the soft afternoon light filtering through the high window. You notice soot lines, horizontal streaks on the walls that trace past years of baking. It's almost geological. The strata of bread. You could probably date a fire just by measuring the thickness of the ash. One lesser-known technique for smoke control: bundled herbs. Some bakers tied bundles of sage, thyme, or lavender above the oven mouth. Ostensibly, this masked the smell, but some believed it actually redirected the smoke. There's no science behind this, of course, but a surprising number of household manuals from the time mention it. "Hang herbs for sweetened breath of the hearth," one says. It's either charming or deeply concerning. In wealthier bakehouses, especially in cities like Florence or Ghent, chimneys became status symbols. A tall, straight chimney meant good airflow. Good airflow meant better baking. Better baking meant higher prices. And in those cities, if your chimney caused a neighbor's fire, you were liable. Laws were written, fines issued, And in one notorious case from Cologne, a baker was forced to pay for a new roof and provide free bread for a month. The note in the court record? Loaves must not be too small. Ouch. Back in the village, things were less formal, but no less dangerous. You ask the baker how often his chimney is cleaned. He gives you a look that could sour cream. When it stops breathing, he says, which is either poetic or terrifying, depending on the day. Chimney sweeps existed, of course, but they were rare in small towns. More often, the apprentice was sent up with a sack and a stick, told to poke until the sky appears. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't safe, and it didn't always work. There's a legend about a sweep named Elric, who got stuck and had to live in the chimney for 2 days. By the time he got out, the townsfolk had baked him a celebratory cake, out of soot, very thoughtful. You sit again near the edge of the bakehouse, watching the chimney puff slowly. It's quiet now. The fire is dying. The last of the bread is cooling. And still, the smoke snakes upward, carrying with it the residue of effort, risk, and centuries of trial and error. It's strange to think that something as simple as venting smoke could cause so much trouble. But in the Middle Ages, simplicity was often just complexity wearing a rustic cloak. As the wind shifts and the sky darkens with evening, you lean back against the wall and breathe in. Wood smoke, warm bread, a trace of time, and no visible flames where there shouldn't be. A good day. Evening folds gently over the village now. The sun slips behind the hills, and a lavender hue settles over rooftops and fences like a soft wool cloak. One by one, windows glow with flickering orange light. Candles, lanterns, and yes, hearths being banked for the night. But not every fire is winding down. Some are just getting started. Welcome to the world of the midnight bakers. You pass back by the bakehouse as the apprentice waves goodbye. His shift finally over. But another figure moves into view. A new baker, perhaps older, perhaps quieter, sleeves already rolled, hair bound with a strip of cloth. While the village sleeps, these nocturnal guardians of bread begin their watch, because bread waits for no man, and the fire, if extinguished, would have to be coaxed from cold stone again. Night baking wasn't a preference, it was a necessity. Bread had to be ready by dawn for market, meals, and the morning rush, which meant ovens needed to be lit well before sunrise. The only way to do that? Work through the night, stoking flames while the town snored under straw quilts. You follow the baker inside. The room is dim, lit only by firelight and a single oil lamp perched precariously on a wall shelf. The silence is heavy, but not oppressive, just expectant. The only sounds are the crackle of wood, the scrape of a paddle, and the occasional grunt as dough is lifted, folded, and coaxed into shape. These were the unsung hours of medieval life. Long before alarms, schedules, or oat milk lattes, bread dictated its own timetable. Dough had to rise in peace, shaped carefully and set aside just long enough. Not too little, not too long. The ovens needed a steady rhythm of heat, and once you reached the right temperature, you had to move fast. No second chances. And so, in villages and towns across Europe, midnight bakers became silent sentinels. They worked in small crews, often family members, sometimes just one or two individuals, alternating between tending the oven and kneading dough. In some cases, they sang, quietly, low hymns or work songs to pass the hours. In others, they spoke little at all. Words didn't bake bread, fire did. You help lay out a line of shaped loaves on a floured board. The dough is soft, slightly sticky, and dotted with flecks of rye. It's humble, honest food, the kind that feeds not just stomachs, but routines. Farmers will wake and carry this bread into fields. Children will break pieces off as they walk to lessons. The priest will bless a few rounds. And all of it starts here, in the small hours, by a fire most villagers will never see. There's a strange intimacy to this time, a conspiracy of quiet. The baker hands you a mug of something warm, not ale, not quite tea. It smells faintly of mint and roasted barley. You sip, and it anchors you, makes you feel like you belong, even if just for now. Here's a curious historical wrinkle. Some towns banned night fires altogether, even for baking. Too risky, they said. But exceptions were often made for licensed bakehouses under strict rules. A fire inspector might arrive unannounced, sniffing the air like a suspicious fox, and check that the flames weren't too high, the kindling wasn't too green, and the flue was properly clear. Fail, and your oven might be sealed until the next inspection, with clay, literally walled off, bread jail. Historians still debate how widespread these restrictions were. Some argue they were enforced only after major town fires. Others claim night baking was often a gray area, officially discouraged, unofficially tolerated because, well, everyone liked breakfast. One fringe tale from Prague describes a baker who disguised his night shifts as moonlight prayers, lighting incense and humming psalms loudly whenever anyone passed. It worked, until someone realized his incense smelled a lot like rising rye. You watch now as the baker slides the first loaf into the oven. The peel moves like an extension of his arm, confident, steady, practiced. The oven glows, the fire low but strong. You can feel the heat even from here, pressing gently against your cheeks. It's not oppressive, it's reassuring. There's a magic to night baking, the quiet, the focus, the sense that you're part of a secret. Outside, a dog barks once. A rooster, confused by the flickering light, gives a half-hearted crow before realizing it's not time. Somewhere down the lane, someone coughs in their sleep, and inside the dough begins to bake. You smell it before you see it. Yeast, grain, smoke, and something else. Something ancestral. Baking bread at night feels like participating in a rite older than memory. A rhythm that predates language. One delightful tidbit. Some midnight bakers believe certain blessings only took if whispered between moonrise and cockcrow. A prayer for a good bake. A charm against souring. Or even a whispered wish folded into the dough. Did it work? Hard to say, but it made the process sacred in its own quiet way. The baker wipes his hands, nods toward the bench. He's going to check the coals. You sit a while longer, watching the flicker of light on stone. The bread is rising now, slow and steady. The fire murmurs. The walls seem to exhale. You feel a strange peace here amid the ash and the glow. Like time has slowed, or maybe it was never moving all that fast in the first place. And when morning comes, the bread will be ready, and the fire will rest until darkness returns. The first glimmers of dawn press against the horizon now, a pale wash of gold brushing the village roofs, softening the hard edges of stone and timber. The air is still cool, but not cold, just enough bite to make the oven's warmth feel like a private miracle. You and the baker exchange nods, silent in your shared understanding that this night, like many before it, did not end in flame. But now, we venture into a strange, rarely discussed corner of the story. How rules about bread itself help prevent fires. Because, believe it or not, the regulation of crusts and crumb could mean the difference between a warm hearth and a full-on inferno. In the Middle Ages, bread wasn't just food, it was law. Every town had its own rules about how bread was to be baked, shaped, priced, and even smelled. Yes, smelled. Inspectors didn't just check for weight or size, they sometimes performed literal sniff tests. If your bread reeked of burnt crust, sourdough, or suspicious smoke, you were in trouble. You step outside for a moment as the baker opens the oven. A clean gust of heat rolls out, rich with steam and toasted grain. He pulls the first loaves free, neatly shaped, golden, each with a specific pattern scored across the top. This wasn't just decoration, it was identification. Medieval loaves were often stamped or scored with unique marks, so if someone got sick or the bread was underbaked, the village could trace it directly back to the baker responsible. And if the bread was overbaked, if the crust was black, or worse, charred to the point of crumbling like burnt paper, it raised more than just eyebrows. It signaled something was wrong with the oven, the fuel, or the timing. And in a world where fire safety was communal, that kind of mistake was seen not just as sloppy, but as dangerous. That's why in cities like Paris, London, and Bologna, bakers were subject to surprise inspections. Town officials would arrive unannounced, check the oven, the fire, the loaves. One particularly dramatic rule from 14th century Florence stated that if a loaf was found hollow, bitter, or scorched, the baker could be fined or even publicly shamed. His bread broken in front of a crowd. The message was clear: bake responsibly or bake elsewhere. Historians still argue whether these inspections were more about food quality or fire safety. Some suggest it was both. After all, a poorly managed fire could ruin the bread and the building. Others claim the rules were often political, used to punish rivals or assert control over guilds. Regardless of motive, the result was the same. Bakers tread carefully. You follow the baker now as he lays out the loaves on a long wooden rack, each one cooling in its own little steam cloud. He checks the bottom of each with a quick flip, watching for color, texture, cracking. One loaf fails the test. He frowns, sets it aside, mutters something about ash drift. No one will eat that one, but no one will burn because of it either. Even the shape of bread was regulated. Long loaves had to be placed just so in the oven to avoid tipping, cracking, or, heaven forbid, catching fire at the ends. Rounds were safer, easier to control. Some towns banned certain shapes altogether during dry seasons. One hilarious record from Prague forbade bread horns in the summer because their curled ends were inviting to flame. Quirky, yes, but the logic was real. Bread that caught fire could turn a baking session into a disaster, and because ovens weren't airtight, one flare-up could send sparks shooting out the mouth and into the thatch eaves of a nearby house. So precision mattered. Loaf shape, spacing, even the angle of placement was part of fire prevention. You sit near the edge of the bench, listening to the sound of crusts cracking as they cool. The baker offers you another roll, this one perfect, just faintly dusted with flour. You bite in, and for a moment nothing exists except warmth, salt, and the quiet victory of not dying in a blaze. Here's a strange little tidbit. In some towns, bread ovens had to be inspected after every bake session. A designated oven sniffer, not the most glamorous role, would lean in, check for lingering embers, hidden flames, or soot buildup. They were trained to detect trouble before it spread. One record from Norwich even lists olfactory stipend in a town budget for the man paid to sniff your fire. You can't help but feel his nose deserved a raise. One baker's guild, reportedly in Ghent, kept a fire log book, a literal ledger recording every time an oven flared too hot. smoked too long, or required an emergency dowsing. Each entry had to be signed by 2 witnesses. If your name showed up too many times, you'd be stripped of your guild apron, or worse, assigned to clean soot from the chimney with nothing but a spoon. That part's probably apocryphal, but you want to believe it. Guilds mattered in all this. They weren't just trade unions. They were fire brigades, safety regulators, and community protectors. Bakers taught each other techniques not just for taste, but for survival. When to rake, when to wait, when to whisper to the oven so it didn't explode on you. It wasn't science, it was baker lore. You ask the baker if he was trained by a guild. He nods, gesturing to an old mark carved into the oven wall. A triangle within a circle, their emblem. It means patience, he says, and don't be an idiot with the wood. Good advice. As the sky brightens and the first birds begin to stir, the village yawns to life. Doors creak open, chickens strut, and people begin to arrive, basket in hand, ready to buy the loaves you watched come to life in the dead of night. They see bread, but you see more. You see a contract, a system, a set of silent rules, written not in ink, but in crust. And for one more day, at least, they held the fire at bay. You trail behind the early shoppers now, baskets swinging, soft conversation rising with the mist. The day begins in earnest. Someone chases a pig through the square, a child drops a turnip dramatically, and the baker grumbles under his breath about people touching loaves with unwashed hands. It's easy to forget, amid the bustle, that some of the most disciplined bakers in the medieval world didn't work in villages or cities at all. They lived in silence. They prayed in Latin. They wore robes that smelled of candle wax and barley. Welcome to the monastic kitchen. Monasteries, those secluded sanctuaries of piety and productivity, were among the most sophisticated baking operations of the medieval era. If you were a monk, you didn't just bake bread. You baked it to the glory of God, and hopefully without setting the cloister on fire. You make your way past a small stone chapel toward the abbey on the hill. It looms quietly, the bells still asleep, its walls wrapped in ivy and morning light. Inside, the kitchen is already awake. A monk in a brown habit tends a fire, his hands moving with the kind of calm that comes from decades of repetition. The oven is larger than the village bakehouse, more refined, its arch etched with Latin blessings. A faint scent of rosemary drifts through the air. Bread in a monastery wasn't just food, it was sacrament, fuel, charity. It fed not only the monks, but the poor at the gates, the guests in the guest house, and the sick in the infirmary. Monks didn't mess around, and while they weren't immune to the dangers of fire, they approached baking with a kind of holy reverence and an impressively strict protocol. One monk ladles water near the oven door, watching for the telltale hiss. Another scribes something into a parchment log. Yes, they had logs. Temperature approximations, dough behavior, fuel notes. You stare, impressed. It's like a medieval laboratory, except the experiments are mostly edible. Interestingly, the monasteries were among the first institutions to formalize baking procedures. Recipes were passed down meticulously. Ovens were cleaned daily, not weekly. Firewood was stored by age, dryness, and even Saint's Day. You imagine someone muttering, "Ah yes, this log is from the Feast of St. Balthazar." Excellent heat retention. But even here, accidents happened. One record from a Benedictine abbey in 1227 recounts an oven mishap that singed the scriptorium wall and startled several geese. The monk responsible was reportedly reassigned to vegetable washing for a month. Another, more dramatic entry from Cluny speaks of a fire so intense that the cloister bell tower filled with smoke, and a novice mistook it for divine judgment. Spoiler, it was just overproofed wheat rolls. Historians still argue whether monastic fire prevention was truly superior or simply better documented. Monks loved documentation. Every burn mark became a lesson. Every soot stain was a sermon. There are actual marginal notes in illuminated manuscripts that read, "This page smells of smoke due to Brother Cedric's forgetfulness." That's not just passive aggression. That's passive aggression with penmanship. The monk beside you now tends to something unexpected. Hot cross buns. Yes, they existed, though not always called that. Sweetened bread with crosses scored on top, flavored with spices and dried fruit, eaten during Lent, prayed over, and occasionally used to signal a holy baking day. The cross wasn't just symbolic, it also helped vent steam, a theological and thermodynamic flourish in one. You ask if the buns ever burned. The monk smiles sheepishly. "When God is distracted," he says, then adds, more seriously, "or when Brother Thomas forgets to set the hour candle." Ah yes, the hour candle, a timekeeping device used in many monasteries, a tall wax candle marked with lines. As it burned, it measured time, perfect for pacing prayers or baking. You imagine how many loaves were ruined because a draft burned the candle too fast, or a rat bumped it over, sending a monk sprinting in sandals toward a smoking oven. Fire safety in monasteries wasn't left to chance. There were designated cellarers and kitcheneers, monks responsible for managing supplies and overseeing the bakehouse. Some even trained in fire prevention, carrying buckets or tools fashioned from iron hooks and damp cloths. And when a bake was underway, a bell might be rung to signal no torches allowed. One abbey even painted the phrase, "Quiet the flame, feed the soul," on its kitchen lintel. Catchy. And yet, despite all the discipline, the divine intervention, and the detailed logs, accidents still crept in. One infamous tale from Ireland tells of a monk who, during Lent, became distracted by visions of angels. He forgot the bread entirely. The oven caught fire. The cloister smoked. And his penance? Baking alone for 40 days without speaking. A true test of silence, suffering, and sourdough. You sit now near a long bench where loaves cool under linen cloths. The bread is perfect, fragrant, modestly shaped, no scorch marks. You bite into one and taste history. The blend of faith, fire, flour, and fear. One fun detail. Monks sometimes carve scripture verses into large loaves, tiny ones, meant not to be read, but to symbolically protect the bread from burning. Not a guaranteed method, but hey, divine insurance is divine insurance. A bell rings softly. Matins. The monks gather in quiet rows, heads bowed. One remains behind to tend the oven. The fire whispers now, steady, controlled, a kind of monastic heartbeat. And as you step out into the fresh air, bread tucked under your arm, you feel oddly comforted. If anyone could keep the fire tamed, it was these robe-wearing bread whisperers. They weren't just baking, they were practicing devotion, one loaf at a time. You leave the monastery behind, bread still warm under your arm, and descend the hill back toward the village, the path crunching softly underfoot. But something's shifted. The sun has climbed, the streets are busier, and the air feels tighter, as if tension clings to the corners of buildings. You see women hunched over wash basins, whispering. A man gestures sharply toward the bakehouse. Children glance sideways and scurry. Something's brewing, and not in the comforting, barley-scented way. This section of the story is darker. Because in the Middle Ages, fire didn't just burn buildings. Sometimes it burned reputations, and in certain places, it burned lives. Welcome to the uneasy overlap between baking mishaps and accusations of sorcery. You round a corner and see the village bakehouse surrounded by murmuring townsfolk. There's no smoke, no flame, just suspicion. A loaf is held aloft, half blackened, crust torn awkwardly. The woman holding it gestures wildly, shouting that the baker's wife must have hexed the dough. You hear muttered words: curse, burning sign, unnatural rise. You step back into the shadows. You know where this is going. Throughout medieval Europe, when ovens misfired, when bread exploded, scorched, or simply failed to rise, it wasn't always chalked up to bad yeast or poor technique, especially when a woman was involved. In many towns, bakehouses were shared spaces. Women often worked there or near them. They helped prep dough, clean tools, even tend the fire when the baker stepped out. But if something went wrong, all too often they became suspects. Historians still argue how often bakers' wives, daughters, or female brewers were accused of witchcraft. Some say it was rare. Others argue it was alarmingly common, especially in regions with strict guild systems that excluded women. One chilling note from a German court record in 1456 reads, "The fire in the oven refused to die. She was present. The bread turned black. She knew things." You don't need to know the rest. Fire was mysterious, unpredictable, and when it escaped control, people searched for something or someone to blame. In some towns, women weren't even allowed near the oven unsupervised, not because they were incapable, but because of the fear that their presence might be the reason bread misbehaved. In folklore, witches could bewitch the flame, cause loaves to bake unevenly, sour milk across the room, or, more ominously, call fire into the rafters. You duck into the bakehouse where the baker, red-faced and wild-eyed, mutters under his breath. His wife is silent, seated in the corner, her eyes dry but furious. The loaf in question sits on the table, innocent and, honestly, slightly overbaked, but otherwise unremarkable. But perception isn't about facts. It's about fear. A quirky tidbit. In some regions, test loaves were made to prove innocence. If the accused could bake a clean, unburned loaf under watchful eyes, it was taken as a sign they were not in league with dark forces. If it cracked, or failed to rise, or singed even slightly, well, you can guess. These trial bakes were crude and often rigged. Ovens could be tampered with, temperatures were unpredictable, and some towns demanded the accused bake with holy flour, which honestly sounds like a branding opportunity gone terribly wrong. And of course, fire itself was used as a test, the infamous trial by ordeal. A woman might be ordered to hold hot iron, or walk across burning embers, or, worst of all, be locked inside a bakehouse during a small, controlled fire to see if she survived. If she did, innocent. If not, well, the reasoning, you see, was airtight. The fear of witchcraft wasn't always rooted in malice. Sometimes it was just confusion. A loaf rose too fast, the crust blistered in an odd pattern. A spark leapt from the oven at the wrong moment. All things that could be explained by heat, moisture, fuel, quality. But to a villager unfamiliar with thermodynamics, it felt like magic. And so women paid the price. You sit now on a stool near the fire, the baker pacing, the room tense. Outside, voices rise. The local magistrate will probably be summoned. He'll ask questions. The baker's wife might bake a loaf under his supervision. If it turns out all right, she'll be left alone. for now. If it doesn't, there's a long silence. Then the baker speaks. "She's baked for 15 years, he says quietly. "She needs better than I do." The fire listens to her hands. You glance at her. She doesn't smile, but there's a flicker in her eyes. Maybe pride, maybe sorrow. Another fringe case comes to mind. In 1471, a woman in Denmark was accused of cursing an oven because her neighbor's dough refused to rise. Her defense: "I wasn't even home. I was at market buying eggs." The record shows she was acquitted, but only after the priest intervened and blessed her entire house, oven included. Her bread never burned again. Or perhaps no one said it did. You realize something as you sit in the bakehouse that day. For all the charm of medieval life, the songs, the scent of bread, the dance of firelight, there were shadows too. Not just the fear of flame, but of each other, and especially of women who knew too much about heat, timing, and dough. The baker's wife rises now. She moves to the oven, opens it, and calmly slides in a new loaf. The room is still. Outside, the murmuring pauses. You watch. The fire flickers. The dough begins to rise, and no one burns. Today, the tension has lifted for now. The crowd is dispersed, some embarrassed, others disappointed that their morning didn't end in a dramatic trial, or the smell of scorched linen. You step back into the sunlight, grateful the fire stayed where it belonged. But don't get too comfortable, because now we venture into the explosive side of medieval baking. Literally. Welcome to Oven Explosions 101, a class no one asked for, but everyone at some point in the Middle Ages seemed to enroll in by accident. You wouldn't think something as cozy as a bread oven could erupt with the enthusiasm of a poorly sealed cauldron, but you'd be wrong. Medieval ovens, particularly the larger dome-style ones, were essentially controlled combustion chambers, and when that control failed, through bad timing, too much moisture, or sheer bad luck, they could erupt like a very, very domestic volcano. You pass a scarred stone at the back of the bakehouse now, its surface pocked and cracked. The baker tells you in the flat tone of someone who's repeated this story many times, "That was the big one, the rye blast of 62. You don't ask. He doesn't elaborate. You both nod and move on. So how does a bread oven explode? Start with moisture. If a baker didn't let the wood burn long enough before raking out the embers, the oven walls wouldn't be fully dry. Medieval ovens, especially clay ones, were porous. And if moisture got trapped inside the walls, it turned to steam. Pressure built, and if there was no vent or the vent was blocked, boom. A chunk of wall might shoot across the room. In one case from southern France, a chunk flew through a door and embedded itself in a cartwheel. The cart was fine. The door, not so much. Then there's the dough itself. Overproofed loaves, particularly large communal batches, sometimes release steam in unpredictable ways. If a batch was loaded too tightly and sealed too soon, internal pressure could build like a slow cooking grenade. Most of the time, this meant a loud whoomp, a cracked crust, maybe some startled birds. But occasionally, it meant dough detonating, splattering hot paste across the oven, baker, and anything within splash radius. The worst part, the cleanup. Burned on dough is harder to remove than regret, and the tools didn't help. Wooden paddles left leaning too close to the oven mouth could ignite and fall in. One flaming handle wedged into a hot oven floor, mixed with damp flour or spilled fat, and suddenly you had flame soup. One English record from the 14th century describes an event called the Bakehouse Roar, in which an improperly cleaned oven, loaded hastily after a rainstorm, let out a thunderclap that knocked two men off their stools and singed off someone's beard. His name was apparently Jeff. He did not return to baking. Historians still debate the frequency of these explosions. Some argue they were rare and dramatized. Others point to repeated mentions in town records, insurance disputes, and the occasional sermon that included, "Even the righteous may be tested by hot crusts," which either proves the danger was real, or that medieval clergy had a weird sense of metaphor. Back in the present, you sit again by the oven mouth, staring at its blackened interior. The baker, now comfortable with your presence, offers you a sliver of hardened bread stuck to the wall, an oven scab, he calls it. It's chewy, slightly bitter, possibly from last week. You eat it anyway, because this is about immersion now. Another curious element, steam holes. Some bakers drilled small vent holes into the sides of their ovens to allow moisture to escape during the large bakes. This helped prevent explosions and gave an auditory cue. The hiss of steam was a kind of safety whistle. No hiss, bad sign. Too much hiss, even worse. One clever baker in Italy reportedly trained a pigeon to fly away when it heard the wrong hiss. Pigeon-based fire detection didn't catch on, but you respect the effort. One fringe tale, possibly apocryphal, tells of a bishop visiting a bakehouse when the oven cracked loudly mid-bake. The bishop, convinced it was divine wrath, flung himself flat on the ground and shouted psalms until the oven cooled. It didn't explode. The bread turned out fine. The bishop commissioned a stained glass window celebrating the mercy of heat. But not every explosion was dramatic. Most were smaller. Sharp cracks, bits of plaster raining down, scorched fingertips. Enough to remind you that baking wasn't quaint. It was volatile. And that's what makes it so human. These people, long before us, learned to walk the line between nourishment and destruction. Every time they lit the fire, they danced with risk. You glance at the baker's hands, scarred, thick-skinned, with little patches of missing hair from years of close calls. He doesn't talk about them. He doesn't need to. The oven remembers for him. And yet, the fire is still lit. The dough still rises. The bread still feeds the town. Because they need it. And because somewhere along the way, someone decided that the risk was worth the crust. The baker shrugs. "No burn today," he says, not quite smiling. Then adds, "Check back tomorrow." You nod. Tomorrow always holds the potential for a boom, but also for bread. The morning wears on. Birds flutter through rafters, the streets clatter with hooves and wooden wheels, and the scent of a dozen different meals begins to blend into the air. Meat stews, burnt onions, something fishy, and of course, bread. Always bread. But now, things slow. You follow the baker back into the quieter rhythm of the midday lull, and he invites you to sit a while. There's a waiting that happens now. A pause in the fire dance, because some bread doesn't happen quickly. Some loaves are patient. This is the story of the sourdough that waited. Not every medieval bake was immediate, while quick loaves, flatbreads, simple rounds, trenchers were baked daily for hungry mouths and morning markets. More complex breads took their time, days sometimes, especially those made from wild fermented starters. The earliest versions of what we now call sourdough. You sit near the baker's prep table now, where a cloth covers a bowl. He lifts the edge slightly, revealing a bubbling, living mass. It hisses softly, like it's whispering secrets in gluten. It's not pleasant to look at. Grayish, flecked, smelling faintly of vinegar and damp apples. But it's alive. And it's what gives this next batch of bread its character. Medieval bakers didn't have instant yeast. They had patience. Starters were cultivated from flour and water left to attract wild yeast from the air. A gamble, yes. But once it worked, they fed it daily, like a strange pet. If it died, panic. If it thrived, celebration. And when it smelled just right, tangy but not sour, sweet but not spoiled. It was time. But before you could bake with it, the fire had to be just so. This is where things got delicate. Because the dough demanded a long rise, and that meant the fire needed to be ready after the dough, not before. Mistime that, and you either had a roaring oven with no bread, or a fermented loaf collapsing from overproofing, while the oven grumbled along at a lazy 200 degrees. Celsius wasn't a thing yet, but you know what we mean. The baker glances at his firewood, then at the bowl, then back again. Still waiting, he murmurs. Not to you, to the dough, maybe to the oven, maybe to God. Here's where the danger crept in. Not from dramatic sparks or flaring thatch, but from impatience. A baker trying to rush a slow dough might overfuel the fire to keep it hot longer, or worse, relight a waning fire too soon, cracking the oven from sudden temperature shift. One baker in Lübeck supposedly cracked his oven 3 times in 1 year doing this. After the third, he was fined, flogged, and, most tragically, banned from baking until he proved his dough timing judgment in front of a town judge. He passed. Barely. You ask how long this dough will wait. The baker shrugs. Until it tells me. Which is either poetic or evasive. You spend the next while observing the quiet rituals of a baker at rest. He oils the paddle handle, sweeps stray flour into a neat pile, rolls his shoulders like a man recovering from a long fight. And every few minutes he lifts the cloth and peers at the dough again, nose close, brow furrowed, judging invisible metrics. Historians still argue whether medieval sourdough was as consistent as modern versions. Some suggest it was entirely unpredictable. Flavor, rise, even shape varied day by day. Others believe bakers developed remarkable instinct. Either way, the process was treated with a kind of mystical reverence. Some towns named their starters. Others passed them down like heirlooms. One monastic record refers to a starter as the brother of loaf. You want that on a t-shirt. As the dough finally begins to dome, the baker nods. Subtly, to himself. It's time. But first the oven. Now, the fire must be coaxed. Not fed, not stoked. Coaxed. The heat must be precise. Too hot, and the long fermented crust will blister and split. Too cold, and the loaf turns to a gummy brick. The baker presses a palm to the oven lip, waits. He scatters a pinch of flour inside and watches how it browns. Then he nods again. A language of fire and flour. He slides the dough in carefully. Not quickly. Slowly, deliberately. Like he's placing a child into bed. The door closes with a thud that feels final and full of trust. Now, we wait again. A quirky fact. In some towns, bakers marked sourdough bake days with ribbons or chalk signs on their door. It was a social signal. Fancy bread was coming. People might linger, watch, sniff, and if the bake went well, the baker earned something rare. Reputation. If it didn't, well, sourdough has a way of loudly announcing its displeasure in the form of collapsed loaves and scorched bottoms. And still, the fire must be managed. The coals nudged, the draft adjusted, the silence observed. The baker doesn't talk now. He sits near the door, eyes half closed, breathing in time with the oven. You sit beside him, letting the minutes stretch. There's something sacred in this pause, something eternal. Because long before timers and thermometers, this is how bread was born. From patience, from listening, from heat that waited. After what could be 20 minutes or 2 hours, Time is foggy in the presence of fire. The baker rises. He opens the oven slowly. Inside, the loaf has risen to its full potential. The crust is dark, crackled like old parchment, aromatic with tang and smoke. He slides it out reverently and sets it on the table. You lean in. It smells like time. It smells like effort. It smells like peace earned, not given. And it didn't need to explode to prove its power. The afternoon sun slants lazily across the village square now, casting long shadows and warming the stones underfoot. Children's laughter echoes somewhere near the fountain, and the smell of stew thickens in the air. But back inside the bakehouse, something else is stirring. Something secretive, exclusive, and just a little intimidating. You're about to overhear whispers from the guarded world of the bakers' guilds, where crust was power and knowledge could be restricted. Guilds were more than trade associations. In many parts of medieval Europe, they were little empires of flour and fire, setting prices, training apprentices, policing standards, and perhaps most importantly, guarding the secrets of the bake. Yes, there were secrets. Actual, whispered, passed down only by oath techniques that certain bakers knew, and others never would. You ease yourself onto a bench near the cooling racks. The baker, who's grown surprisingly tolerant of your company, finally speaks in a lower voice. You ever heard of ash-proofing? You shake your head. Exactly. He says with a grin that somehow manages to look both proud and mildly conspiratorial. Turns out, ash-proofing was a technique to protect loaves from the fine layer of embers that might remain after a quick rake. The guilds taught how to brush the hearth with a certain dampened bundle of straw, not too wet, not too dry, to leave just enough heat and remove just enough soot. Done wrong, the bread would taste like someone baked it in a fireplace. Done right, it was flawless. You ask how he learned it. Guild taught me, he says simply. After I passed my heat test. Your ears perk. Heat test? He chuckles, rubbing his hands together. Every journeyman had to stand in front of the oven, bare-faced, and judge the heat by feel. If you flinched too fast, you weren't ready. If you held too long, you weren't smart. But if you got it just right, he trails off. Then they showed you the flame fold. You want to ask what that is, but he doesn't say. Instead, he turns away to check the next batch. Guild secrets were real, and some were strangely theatrical. In Paris, it's said that the Grand Pain Guild performed its initiation at midnight on the feast of Saint-Honoré, patron of bakers. The initiate had to kneel before a burning oven and recite the Oath of the Rise, a poem half sermon, half recipe, which included the mysterious line, "Fire ye must tame, not fear." If he succeeded, he was handed a sacred paddle engraved with a wheat sheaf and the year of his acceptance. Historians still debate how much of this was symbolic and how much was real. Some argue that most guild rituals were exaggerated later by romantic chroniclers. Others point to surviving tools, etchings, and even meeting notes that suggest, yeah, the bakers were serious about keeping their methods in the family. And it wasn't just techniques. Guilds protected knowledge about fuel types, fermentation tricks, crust coloring, steam tricks, and oven maintenance. One secret involved how to use river stones to retain moisture during a long bake. Another taught a particular way to score dough so it expanded in a spiral rather than a burst. Even burn management, when to let a crust get almost too dark before pulling, was a guarded art. You lean back and look at the bakehouse anew. It's no longer just a kitchen. It's a kind of temple, a place where knowledge passed from hand to hand, over decades, in heat and hardship. and not everyone was welcome. Guilds were notoriously selective. In some cities, only men from bred families could even apply. Others required a sum of money, a sponsor, and a perfect sample loaf. One fringe story from Flanders tells of a woman who, disguised as a man, passed the guild trial by baking a flawless rye boule with a marbled crust and perfect crumb. She was accepted, briefly, until someone noticed she refused to drink from the shared guild cup. The guild expelled her. The records say nothing of what became of her, but a nearby town, curiously, saw a sudden rise in perfect rye loaves. And of course, guilds were also fire regulators. If a member caused a bakehouse fire, the guild might fine him, demote him, or in extreme cases, exile him. Yes, guild exile was a thing. One London record notes that Robert of the Burnt Roof was barred from practice for 5 years after a roof beam scorched during a Lenten bake. His name, sadly, stuck longer than his punishment. You return your attention to the baker, now moving through his space with something like choreography. Every motion has intention. Paddle down, loaf turned, coal checked, cloth folded. There's no waste, no error. It's not just skill. It's tradition honed through fire. Why all the secrecy? You ask. He shrugs. Same reason you don't tell everyone where the village well is. If they know too much, they stop respecting the source. You nod. Not because you entirely agree, but because it suddenly makes sense. In a world where bread meant survival, knowing how to make it, and how not to burn the town down in the process, wasn't just a trade. It was a kind of magic, passed not with spells, but with scorched fingers and silent lessons, and only to those who earned it. The sun begins its slow descent now, casting everything in a warm, golden hush. The village shifts with it. Traders packing up stalls, goats yawning. Yes, goats yawn. And the smell of supper starting to simmer behind shuttered windows. But inside the bakehouse, the fire still crackles, the walls still glow, and stories continue to simmer just beneath the surface. Because as much as bread gave life, it could also invite judgment. Harsh, public, fiery judgment. Welcome to the unsettling reality of trials by fire, sometimes metaphorical, sometimes not. You're seated again on the bench near the oven. The baker, older, dusted with flour, and shaped by years of heat, leans back, arms crossed, a loaf cooling on the table beside him. You want to hear the worst of it? He asks. You nod. Sometimes the village didn't wait for proof. Turns out when fire struck, when a bakehouse burned or a bread cart went up in flames, there was often no careful investigation. There was just blame. And in the Middle Ages, few people carried more public pressure than the baker. Everyone ate bread. Everyone needed it. And if that daily need wasn't met, the town had questions. You learn of a case from 1324 in a village outside Rouen. A bakehouse fire caught 2 nearby homes, 1 child's cradle, and a storeroom filled with grain. The baker was accused of negligence. His fire too high, too long, too close to uncleaned ash. The town held a tribunal, not in a court, but in the marketplace. They made him stand in front of the scorched ruin and swear, under oath, that he had tended the fire carefully. When he hesitated, someone threw a crust at him. Someone else threw a rock. He lived, but he never baked again. These weren't official witch trials or church-led inquisitions. These were village reckonings, raw, immediate, fueled by grief, hunger, and the ever-present terror of fire. Sometimes there were fines, sometimes exile, and sometimes they weren't content with the punishment alone. One chilling tale from Bavaria speaks of a baker whose oven flared during an unusually dry summer. A dozen buildings lost. No lives, but everything else. The town forced him into what they called the burning circle. A trial where he had to bake a perfect loaf without causing even the slightest smoke drift. If he failed, he'd be stripped of his tools and banned from touching fire for 10 years. He succeeded. Barely. Historians still argue about the validity of these stories. Some claim they're exaggerated or symbolic. Cautionary tales used to train apprentices and warn reckless journeymen. Others say they're based on truth. Town records, fines, bakehouse rebuilding grants. They all suggest that some kind of communal justice did take place, usually fast and emotionally charged. Back in the bakehouse, the baker pulls out a scorched board from behind the oven. It's blackened, the edges curled like old bark. This, he says, was all that was left after the 139 fire. He doesn't clarify what 139 refers to. A year, a temperature, a tally of some kind. But the weight in his voice doesn't need context. He places a new board on the hook above the hearth, next to others. Some marked, some clean. Every baker earns a scar, he says. We just hope it doesn't take anyone else down with us. You notice now the little ways fire judgment shows up in daily life. A charred notch on the oven lip, where someone long ago burned themselves reaching in too fast. A stone near the doorway, etched with initials and a date. Perhaps a baker lost. Perhaps one reborn. Even the pattern on the paddle. Not just decoration, but a record. The grain line of responsibility. A quirky detail. In some towns, bread was used as a literal testimony tool. During disputes, parties might be asked to break bread together from a neutral bake. If they refused, it was seen as admission of guilt. If they ate, it was a sign of peace. But if the bread cracked oddly, say if it crumbled or gave off smoke, it could be taken as a divine sign of dishonesty. Imagine being undone by an overly dry crust. And when a bakehouse caught fire, the community came running, not just with buckets, but with judgment. Was it poor fire tending? Was it bad wood? Was it sabotage? You begin to realize that bakehouses weren't just physical places. They were emotional lightning rods. Everyone needed them. Everyone feared them. And no one forgot them. There's a story from Naples of a baker who survived 3 separate bakehouse fires. The third time, he walked straight into the town square, laid his paddle on the ground, and declared himself cursed. He left the city that night. The next morning, someone painted his oven with the phrase, "Fuoco non dimentica," fire does not forget. You sit quietly now, watching the last loaf of the day cool on the table. The baker doesn't say much anymore. His movements are slower. The fire is low, but there's something sacred in this silence. The knowledge that every good bake was a triumph. That every loaf pulled from the oven without burning the house down was a quiet miracle. And that not all trials leave scars on the body. Some burn into the walls, some into memory, but most leave a mark in the shape of bread. The village is quiet now, hushed by the golden stillness of late afternoon. Smoke drifts from chimneys like the sighs of weary houses. The baker leans against the doorway, arms folded, watching the sky turn amber above the trees. You join him, both of you gazing toward the edge of town, where the fields ripple and the air feels just a little freer. It's here he tells you something odd, something you didn't expect to hear in a story about bread. Did you know, he says, that the king once told us where to put our ovens? You blink. That's right. Royal Burn notices, because sometimes it wasn't just your neighbors, your guild, or the suspiciously flammable chickens you had to worry about. Sometimes the crown got involved. Across medieval Europe, monarchs issued proclamations, sometimes broad, sometimes bizarre, that regulated the placement of bakehouses. Why? Because even kings knew that one stray ember could reduce a loyal village to a smoky ruin. So royal edicts emerged, dictating where, how, and in some cases, if you could bake. You and the baker walk slowly toward the village's edge, where a weathered wooden sign leans awkwardly against a fence post, faded, chipped, but still legible. It reads, "By decree of his grace, no oven shall be built within 12 paces of dwelling walls." It's signed with a year and a symbol, a crown balanced over a sheaf of wheat. The logic was simple. Ovens needed space, fire needed boundaries, and kings, despite living in stone castles far removed from peasant cook fires, didn't want rebellion sparked by negligence, burned the wrong block of houses, and suddenly, bread wasn't the only thing rising. So distance was mandated. Construction was controlled. In some places like London and Paris, the laws were even stricter. Communal bakehouses were built under royal supervision. Their dimensions were regulated, their firewood inspected, and their location mapped in city plans. In a few rare cases, town ovens were placed near rivers so that if they caught fire, water buckets were close at hand. If it seems excessive, remember, these were cities of wood and thatch and candlelight. A good oven was helpful. A bad oven was catastrophic. Historians still argue whether these royal decrees were truly about fire safety or just another method of taxation and control. Some suggest kings used oven placement laws as an excuse to exert power over urban planning. Others believe the laws were responses to very real disasters. One document from the reign of Henry III cites the burning of 44 houses near the bakeries of Southwark as justification for a new ordinance. Another from Frederick II in Sicily refers to the smoldering ruin of 2 parishes and 3 goat barns. And if you disobeyed the royal burn notice, the consequences varied. Fines mostly, sometimes forced relocation, occasionally confiscation of your oven, which, by the way, meant they literally came and bricked it up. One poor soul in York had his bakehouse decommissioned by royal masons after being caught baking in prohibited proximity to a granary. They left a sign on the sealed door, "May your bread find cooler fire." A nice insult, if a bit passive-aggressive. The baker beside you snorts. "My grandfather's oven used to be there," he says, pointing to a small patch of earth beside a crumbling wall. But then the Duke's inspector came. He doesn't elaborate, but the scorch marks along the base of the wall tell a story. A quirky fringe case? In 14th century Hungary, a royal advisor attempted to design fireproof bakehouses using dome-shaped stone chambers surrounded by moats of water. He claimed it would eliminate all oven-related fire risks. They built one. It flooded. Bread turned to porridge. End of experiment. But the royal interest didn't stop at location. In some areas, kings regulated when you could bake. During festivals, certain ovens were required to operate continuously for public feasts, at crown expense. Other times during drought or war, baking was restricted to specific days to conserve fuel and avoid overheating the town. Imagine being told by royal decree that today was not a bread day. Now imagine explaining that to a crowd of hungry laborers. You sit now at the edge of the field, listening to the wind and the gentle creak of trees. The baker drops down beside you with a tired grunt, pulling a small roll from his pouch. "This one," he says, "was baked in the king-approved oven zone." You both laugh. It's dry, slightly overcooked, but somehow that makes it better. It's strange to think of power stretching into something so ordinary as where you put your oven, but in the Middle Ages, nothing was just ordinary. Fire was a public issue, bread was a political necessity, and if the king could control the crust, he could remind you who ruled not just the land, but the heat beneath your feet. One last curiosity. Some royal edicts included specific wording that the oven must be visible from the street. This wasn't just about convenience, it was about accountability. If your oven was hidden, you could be blamed for any fire within 10 houses. But if it was public, everyone could see you tending it. Everyone knew where the risk lived. It was surveillance. Through soot, you finish the roll, crumbs falling into the grass. The baker stands stretching, his eyes scanning the rooftops once more. Still standing, he says, for now, because fire listens to no man, not even a king. The light is soft now, slipping from gold into rose, then into the muted blue of evening. You walk through the village square once more, where the day's energy has begun to fade into tired footsteps and low voices. A few shopkeepers sweep their stoops, and the last of the bread has been sold. But behind the bakehouse, in the shadows where accounts are settled and favors exchanged, another layer of fire politics once ruled the rhythm of medieval baking. This is where we meet the unspoken economy of bread tax and burn bribes. Yes, baking wasn't just flour and fire, it was finance. And in towns across Europe, access to ovens and the fuel to fire them was often tangled in fees, loopholes, and a quiet kind of corruption that involved more crust than coin. You sit near the bakehouse now as the baker empties a small pouch onto the table. Inside are a few copper coins, a scrap of parchment, and, curiously, a dried fish. Rent, he mutters, rolling his eyes. And a bribe. He gestures toward the coins. That's the oven tax. The fish is for the fire warden. He says it like this is normal, because it was. In many towns, bakers didn't own their ovens. They leased them from the lord, the church, or the town council. These ovens were considered public infrastructure, and access came with a cost, sometimes daily, sometimes weekly. It was called the banal fee, a holdover from feudal rights where peasants had to pay to use their lord's mill, press, or, yes, oven. The idea was you didn't get to play with fire unless you paid for the privilege, but of course fire wasn't always fair. Taxes varied wildly. One town might charge a flat rate per loaf, another might charge by weight, by day, or by fuel used. And then there were the extras, fees for ash disposal, fees for late night baking, fees for smoke nuisance. One particularly inventive town in Saxony instituted a noise tax on bakers who clanged too loudly before dawn. No one liked the clanging. Historians still argue whether these taxes were effective safeguards or just a way to extract more money from an already scorched profession. Some say they funded fire brigades and town improvements. Others suggest they padded the pockets of officials who hadn't lifted a dough paddle in their lives. One account from Prague describes a bakehouse official who arrived each week, took the tax, inspected the hearth, and then requested a gift for his journey home. His journey was a block and a half. The baker before you shrugs as he counts the coins. I give the clerk a loaf every Thursday. Keeps the inspections quick and quiet. You're not sure if he's proud or just tired. Probably both. Sometimes bribes weren't just to keep things moving, they were to keep things lit. In towns with strict fire ordinances, baking outside designated hours was banned. But let's say it's the feast of St. Martin. Everyone wants bread. You're behind. The fire's low. You need to bake at night. So, you slip the inspector a sweetened roll. or a bottle of cider. And suddenly the rules bend like a hot crust. It wasn't legal, but it was tolerated. And if you couldn't pay, you waited, or you risked it. And if you were caught, you didn't just pay the fee, you paid in reputation. A baker labeled fire thief or coal deceiver might lose customers, or worse, get reported to the guild, who could fine you again and force you to publicly confess your baking sins. One record from Bruges mentions a man who had to stand in the square holding a burnt loaf with the phrase, "I have scorched both bread and law," stitched to his tunic. It was supposed to be humiliating, but honestly, you'd wear that shirt. You glance at the parchment the baker unrolls, an official-looking document with neat inked rows. It lists dates, coin tallies, and a small note at the bottom. Cinders swept, heat sufficient, no excess flame. It's signed with initials and a wax seal, a medieval fire receipt, proof that today at least he baked within the law. But there's something else in the margins. Small symbols, maybe private notes, a fish, a barley stalk, a tiny flame. He sees you noticing. "Marks," he says, "for who expects what? I remember who gets what bread, who wants less crust, who likes a warm roll with the tax." He taps the fish. That's for the coal clerk. He gets herring. You can't help but admire the system, or fear it. One fringe tale from Italy tells of a baker who tried to revolt, refusing to pay the bake tax, arguing that his oven was private and his fire holy. The town shut him down, locked his door, seized his paddle. He protested by building a mobile oven on a cart and baking in the square. People loved it, until a spark hit the mayor's curtain during market day. That was the end of that little experiment. You begin to see how deeply the fire was woven into not just the baking, but the bargaining. Who baked, how much, and when. It was all up for negotiation. Even your fuel might come at a cost. If your usual woodcutter raised prices, you'd find yourself with damp logs and bad crust. Or you might pay a bribe to jump the queue for the good oak. And when things got desperate, well, there were ghost fires. Bakers sneaking coals from neighbors, lighting ovens after curfew, or borrowing fuel under the table. It was risky, but sometimes risk was cheaper than rent. The baker stands now, brushing crumbs from his hands. "Bread's gone," he says, "and so is the tax." You follow him outside, the sky now melting into twilight, stars beginning to blink awake. There's no one left in the square, just the soft sound of an oven settling, its stones cooling slowly like tired lungs. You realize that bread was never just about sustenance. It was about survival, navigation, diplomacy, and sometimes negotiation by crust. Twilight folds over the village like a second roof, cooler, quieter, just as leaky. You walk slowly now, down an alley behind the bakehouse, where the last of the heat breathes out from the stone walls, and the embers inside the oven glow low like tired eyes. But something catches your attention, something subtle and strange. A narrow trench, barely visible in the fading light, carved into the earth and lined with old stones. You follow it with your fingers. It stretches from the side of the bakehouse, winds past a tool shed, and disappears beneath the nearby granary. You glance back at the baker, who's watching you with the amused patience of someone who knows exactly what you're about to ask. "That," he says, "is where tomorrow's fire begins. Welcome to the forgotten ritual of from ember to ember, the quiet, practical magic of carrying flame through time. In a world without matches, lighters, or handy stovetop clicks, fire was precious. You didn't start it from scratch if you could help it. You preserved it, nurtured it, shared it, And for bakers who needed reliable heat before dawn, this meant planning ahead by yesterday's flame. You walk along the trench's path as the baker explains. At the end of each bake, just before extinguishing the fire, he selects a few perfect embers, still glowing, not too hot, not too cool. These embers are buried in ash or stored in a clay pot and placed in a sheltered nook, sometimes even inside the oven itself. Overnight, the ember smolders slowly, breathing shallow, preserved by its cocoon of ash. Come morning, it can be coaxed back to life with kindling and breath. It's not a guaranteed system. Embers go out. Ash gets damp, but when it works, it's a quiet miracle. Continuity without spark. A fire with memory. One fringe fact: some towns built small side chambers into bakehouses just for ember storage. Stone cubbies sealed with wooden plugs. In especially fire-conscious cities like Lübeck or Bruges, there were even designated embersmen, town workers tasked with carrying embers from one oven to another in heavy clay jars. Imagine the job title: Flame Bearer First Class. Historians still argue whether these ember trenches, also called fire runs, were widespread or regional. Some believe they were most common in monastic settings or tightly packed city blocks, where fires were more carefully managed. Others suggest they were an old folk practice, born from necessity, passed down through hands more than words. You peer now into the small fire cavity the baker uses, built into the side of the oven like a secret pocket. He opens it with care, revealing a half-burned log and a soft orange pulse under a pile of ash. You feel the heat on your face. It's not dramatic, it's not roaring, but it's there, waiting, ready. This, he says, was lit 3 days ago, carried ember to ember, no fresh fire since. He sounds proud. He should be, because keeping a fire alive without reigniting it isn't just practical, it's symbolic. It means continuity. It means you did your job yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. It means someone can count on your warmth. There's something haunting about that. You think back to the first embers of this story, the pre-dawn fires, the midnight bakers, the apprentices covered in soot. Each one relied on the flame passed down from the day before. You begin to wonder how far back it goes. How many mornings were lit by the faint heat of a previous sunset? Some legends claim that certain embers were never extinguished, carried in sacred clay vessels from town to town, from country to country. One tale from the Rhone Valley speaks of a baker whose family flame had been burning for over 50 years. When it finally went out during a storm, the story goes that he traveled 2 villages away to borrow an ember from a friend, refusing to break the line. The loaf he baked that day was gifted to the chapel and never eaten. It sits, stone hard, in a glass box to this day. Probably. There were rules too. You couldn't share embers with just anyone. In some places, it was a sign of deep trust, almost familial. Giving someone an ember was like handing them a heartbeat. If they lost it, it reflected on you. If they kept it alive, you were bound by bread. You ask the baker if he ever shares his fire. He nods. Only with Thomas, down the lane. And only on feast days. A pause. And once, during the frost of '89. He doesn't say more. He doesn't have to. You notice a second trench now, smaller, branching off toward what looks like a mill house. It's shallow, filled with charcoal fragments. Old one, he says, used to be shared fire between us and the mill, before the fire ordinance split the lines. That's another detail. As towns grew, bakehouses and mills were often regulated to prevent shared embers. Too many accidents, too many disputes. But in the older neighborhoods, like this one, the traces remain. The secret paths of fire. The baker stirs the embers with a poker, then gently lays a thin log across the top. It catches immediately, the orange deepening, then flickering into life, a new flame from an old one. You sit together as the stars emerge. No words now, just the soft crackle. You think of everything that flame has seen, every loaf it's baked, every near miss it's survived. And tomorrow, when the dough is ready and the oven stands cold, this ember will become fire again. Because sometimes survival is not about ignition, it's about preservation. Night has fully taken hold now, soft and vast and quiet. The last voices have faded, the doors latched, and even the animals have stilled. You sit on a stone beside the bakehouse, warmed by the faint ember still alive inside, the one that will greet tomorrow's bread. You've wandered far through flame and flower, but before we drift into sleep, there's one more lesson left, one final truth to carry with you. It's time to reflect on the lessons in smoke. The baker sits beside you again, rubbing his hands, fingertips dusted with ash and callus. He doesn't say much at first. He just stares up at the stars. When he speaks, his voice is low. Funny thing about fire. Everyone fears the flame, but the smart ones watch the smoke. You follow his gaze to the thin wisp curling from the chimney, the last sigh of a long day's labor, and you realize he's right. In the Middle Ages, smoke wasn't just a byproduct. It was a warning, a whisper, a language. And if you listen carefully, it could teach you everything. Thick, black smoke, too much green wood, dangerous, sparks in the air, overstoked, wind-blown, trouble, no smoke at all. Either the fire's out or something's gone terribly wrong and no one noticed. Every kind of smoke meant something. Bakers knew this, so did brewers, smiths, and even the town constable, who learned to read smoke like others read the sky. You sit quietly, listening to the smoke. Not the sound exactly, but the rhythm, the presence. It's slower now, gentle, harmless. It tells you that today was safe, that no roof caught, no child cried, no midnight bell rang. That's what smoke teaches you in the end. That prevention is quieter than disaster. That care isn't loud, but consistent. That most of the work that saves the village, no one ever sees. The baker leans forward, pokes the last ember with a stick. People talk about fire like it's a beast, something wild, but it's not. It's a mirror. It shows you how you live. He gestures at the oven. You feed it wrong, it fights back. You neglect it, it dies. You rush it, it explodes. But if you give it what it needs, space, air, time, it gives back. And really, isn't that everything? Fire, bread, people. You think back on all you've seen. Apprentices burned and blessed, loaves risen from whispering dough, bakehouse laws carved into stone, guilds guarding secrets like gold, embers carried across alleys like promises, and in all of it, the quiet smoke watching above. The baker rises, pats the oven gently, like saying goodnight to an old friend. She'll be ready in the morning, he says, just needs to rest. And so do you, because now it's time. Time to slip away from the firelight, to leave the crackle behind, to let the warmth of bread and the softness of flour lull you into stillness. And as you lie down, maybe on a straw mattress, maybe just in your imagination, you carry with you the smell of ash and crust, the feeling of soot beneath your fingernails, the sound of a fire that didn't burn too bright, but just enough to feed, just enough to live, just enough to sleep. Good night, keeper of embers. The village still stands, and tomorrow there will be bread, The stars are high now, scattered across the night sky like flour on a baker's apron. The oven has cooled to a soft glow, like the warmth left in your blankets after a long dream. Somewhere, a rooster stirs, but even he knows it's not time yet. Let this stillness wrap around you. Let the quiet of the village ease into your breath. No more flames to tend, no more loaves to shape. Just the gentle knowledge that everything has been done for today, and done well. There's peace in the rhythm of old hands and older ovens, in the hush between batches, in the soft crackle of a fire that only wants to warm. Maybe you carry some ember of that now, a little glow in your chest, a quiet heat, reminding you that care doesn't need noise, and safety doesn't need applause. You've wandered through smoke and soot and story. You've heard the creak of bread cooling, the hush of monks by moonlight, the laughter of apprentices burned and loved by fire. And now, there's only rest. No need to move, no need to wake. Let the darkness hold you. Let the oven cool behind your eyes. Let the world drift into stillness, one breath at a time. You are safe. You are warm. You are home.